Samantha was a lovely young girl who always managed to cheer people up with her radiant smile and jovial attitude. Her constant state of ecstasy and giddiness was contagious to all. Her blonde locks spiraled down her head and framed her face like a perfect picture. Her parents cherished her, her family loved her, and her friends were thrilled by her company. She was 10 years old when she died. Her death had a ripple effect on those around her, spiraling her friends and family into depression, and eventually causing her mother to take her own life by leaping off a 7-story building. Samantha's death was indeed a dark point in the lives of those affected. The curious side of the incident, however, was that no proof was made that Samantha actually died. The factors of her disappearance were set in motion long before Samantha vanished, exactly 2 years beforehand. It all began with Thingy. Thingy was a small clown doll that Samantha had received for her 8th birthday. He wore raggedy blue pants, a yellow shirt with red suspenders, and a big frilly polka-dotted bow tie. His head was made of white plaster and had a wide, bright red grin scrawled into it, like a long scar that ran across his jaw. His arms and legs were woven from twine, and a chain attached to his head that allowed Samantha to drag Thingy around. She had only recently been able to lift him fully off the ground, and his feet were worn from the years of scraping along the floor. Thingy had been given to her when she was just 4 years old by her father, who had attempted to reconcile their relationship after divorcing her mother. She never parted with it, sobbing loudly whenever it was taken from her grasp. School was a tough time for her. To further her maturity, she was not allowed to keep the toy with her during class. The staff had decided that allowing a doll in the classroom would distract others from the learning environment, and forced her to put it in the teacher's locker at the start of class, and would allow her to take it home at the end of the day. This was the process that occurred every day, and it tore Samantha apart every time she had to give her precious doll up. She was often found wandering off at playtime to try and open the locker in which Thingy was being held captive. Only once did her parents query as to whether she had an unhealthy obsession with her toy, but upon asking the teacher their minds were put at ease. After all, many children undergo trouble maturing and disregarding childhood possessions. On the last day of grade 4, the teachers promised her that they would escort her back to her classroom when the graduation ceremony was over, so that she may reclaim Thingy. They didn't. Over the course of the evening, Samantha was encouraged to forget about the doll for a while, and that she did. Thingy was left, discarded in the locker when Samantha drove home that night, with her little certificate of graduation clutched in her hand, and a cardboard mortarboard atop her head. The lights were turned off, and the doors locked. In the darkness of the closed school, a faint wailing could be heard from the teacher's locker, but no one was there to hear it. It went ignored, and faded into the early hours of the morning. It took 3 days for Samantha to realize Thingy was missing. She had been tossing and turning all night, trying desperately to sleep. As she finally started to drift away into her dreamland, suddenly a piercing shriek rattled her imagination and invaded the happiest corners of her brain. She jerked upright and listened for the source of the cry. She recognized its owner, even without hearing it speak before. Thingy was sad, and Samantha had to save him. She tried to awaken her parents, but they were already in a deep slumber, and Samantha needed to save Thingy now. His cries kept resounding through her head, pleading for her to save him. So Samantha decided to sneak out of the house and run all the way to school. She knew the route by memory now, and there was no other option. Thingy was hurt. The road slapped her soles, the wind nipped at her face, and her feet gradually formed blisters, and gravel scraped and cut her as she ran through the night. It was a long while before she finally reached her destination. By the time she'd reached the front gates, it was early in the morning. Mists of rain were scattered about the area, leaving dampness behind in their path. The school loomed above her, daring her to even attempt to come in. The front doors were locked, naturally. However, the nearby fence leading to the playground lay open, still ajar from when a group of vandals had kicked it askew back in the 2nd grade. It was only too easy to walk through the clearly open entrance and then step into the nurse's room. The first aid area was connected to the playground for easy access to weeping children who had slipped on the swings and scraped a knee. It was also left unlocked for easier and quicker connectivity to these victims of playground woe. Samantha simply opened the door and stepped inside her abandoned school. It was cold. The air had an unwarranted heaviness to it and weighed down Samantha's breath, forcing her to gasp for breaths. Nearby lockers creaked, groaned, and swayed in the stillness of the unlit corridors. Sheets of paper fluttered on the ground, moving away from Samantha, guiding her towards her beloved doll. A childish drawing of a girl clutching a doll skipped merrily down the hall, brushing against the walls, and finally coming to a stop, only when a plastic bin fell onto it with an ominous bang. Samantha took another gasp of air and began to shuffle down the passage, moving past the dark classrooms and the wavering lockers. She tried to remember where her classroom was, but the entire building seemed different now, as though it had changed layout since she was last here. It now felt foreign, unfamiliar, and somewhat dangerous. From memory, she thought her room might be somewhere on the east wing of the school, but it could just as likely reside in the west wing, or even perhaps the north wing. She was lost. She was cold. She was scared. Somewhere in the school, a light blew out. Samantha had been wandering the halls for an hour now, searching desperately for her doll. She was beginning to lose all hope, and although fear had petrified her, it was the urgent need for Thingy that kept her going. An unsettling breeze continued to travel throughout the school grounds, even though the air was still. Breathing was still a laborious chore, and it was not helped by her already diminishing ability, being gradually worn away by terror. Just as she was prepared to lie on the icy floor and cry, a piercing scream echoed amongst the halls. It was a plea for help, a beg for mercy, and one that Samantha had to respond to. She ran towards the source of the shout, banging her elbows against the agape locker doors until she finally came to her classroom. For some strange reason, it was left unlocked. Under normal circumstances, Samantha might have pondered over this oddity, but alas, she was frantic, and frantic people often overlook the simplest things. She threw open the door and burst inside. The classroom was in a state of chaos. All the furniture had been hurled about the room as if a violent tornado had swept through the area in a fit of rage. Desks, chairs, whiteboards, and assortments of stationary items were lying against the walls or had smashed together, leaving splinters and ink stains puddled on the ground. A haunting glow seemed to fill the room, but the lights were without power. In the center of the room, standing triumphantly amidst the madness that surrounded it, was the teacher's locker. A faint sobbing could be heard from within. Samantha navigated her way through the discarded furniture and placed her hand on the latch of the locker. It too was unlocked, a rather unusual circumstance, however she thought nothing of it. With a cry of sorrow, she pulled open the door to find Thingy sitting there, just staring at her inanimately. Samantha begged for him to forgive her, but it continued to rest inside the locker with its scarred grin. After minutes of pleading, Samantha moved down to pick him up and to take him home. Her hand touched Thingy's arm, and suddenly, Thingy moved. Its smile distorted and shaped into a deep frown, and his beady eyes glared with hatred and loathing. Samantha gasped, but her surprise was only short-lived, for after she blinked, Thingy's expression had reverted back to normal. As Thingy's smile returned, so did Samantha's, and she continued to pick him up and cuddle him to her cheek. She could have sworn she felt a hot breath beat against her skin, but she disregarded this and assumed it was due to the irrational temperatures the school seemed host to. With a happy skip, she turned to leave, and this was when Thingy bit her. It was not a playful bite, but more one that chewed through her skin and left a range of needle-like imprints in her right cheek. She gasped and dropped Thingy, where he proceeded to crawl towards the door. Samantha stood there in shock, her breath drawing out in long gulps and her face dripping blood into the locker. After a time, her sense came flooding back to her, and she ran out of the classroom. She sprinted down the halls trying to find her way out. The entire building seemed menacing now. The lights flickered on and off, causing Samantha to become disorientated, and the lockers happened to drop the stacks of papers and satchels in her path, tripping her over repeatedly. She started to scream for help, but the sound was swallowed in the air as soon as it left her lips. A malevolent chuckle ricocheted against the walls, forcing its way into her head. An entire door broke free from its hinges and flung itself at Samantha, only missing her due to tripping on a backpack and flying over her head. Somewhere a voice screamed, "You forgot me, you bitch!" and then snickered at her terrified reaction. Tears were streaming down Samantha's face, mixing with the bright red blood on her cheek and leaving behind a trail of watery gore. Shadows on the walls began to dance and laugh at her expense. She could see the nurse's office in the distance, but the corridor seemed to grow longer as she ran down it, keeping her meters away from her escape. Scrap papers filled the air, blinding her as if she had walked into a swarm of bats. With one last desperate lunge, she smashed her body against the door and collapsed onto the floor. The horrors of the school seemed to halt, and stillness once again hung in the air. Samantha pushed herself up and limped to the exit. She emerged into the crisp morning air. The sun was rising, and a yellow glow swept across the playground, reminding her that she was safe now. Then a voice called from the nearby playhouse. "Samantha, come play with me." She jolted and made for the gate. "I'm sorry, Samantha. I'm sorry I bit you. I was just so lonely." She stopped in her tracks. "Let's be friends again. Come play with me, like you used to." She began to step towards the playhouse. "I love you, Samantha." Her body kept moving to the voice, even though her entire mental being screamed at her to run away. "We can play Mum and Dad. You can be the doting, caring mother." She crouched down and stepped into the playhouse. Thingy was sitting on the plastic table grinning at her, blood coating his mouth. "And I'll be the abusive alcoholic husband who beats you and rapes you every night." Samantha heard this and froze. The door behind her slammed shut. A chuckle emanated from the playhouse, followed immediately by a scream.